want to try and stop you being such a bad friend as I've been to some of mine in the past, because of all the things that your friends can give you when you meet them, their pain or their grief is one of the most precious. Why? Because pain is sister to hope. Sometimes hope is all they have, and if you screw up dealing with their pain, imagine what that does to their hope. So what kind of bad news are we talking about? Well, we're not talking about the kind of bad news that says my football team's just gone down 3-0. We're not talking about my bread didn't rise. We're not talking about I've killed my houseplant. No, we're very much talking about things that start conversations with, Simon, I've got something to tell you. Things like, my wife's just left me, I've lost my job, they've repossessed the house, my daughter's got cancer and we don't know if it's treatable. Bad news which puts you at the first 2 bits of the Kubler-Ross curve. Now I know the Kubler-Ross curve is old and overused, but let's stay with it just for a little while. Because the very first thing when you hear bad news that you do is freak out and then you pretend it hasn't happened. And it's only later on that you start bargaining with God or the universe or whatever. But those aren't what I'm interested in today. What I'm talking about today is the stuff that you do in the very first few minutes of hearing the bad news. So let's start by looking at the other side of the equation. What about giving bad news? Well, that's quite well researched and quite well understood. And there are lots of models you can choose from. There's the ABCDE model, there's the breaks model, there's the nurses model, for nurses unsurprisingly, there's the spikes model, there's even research on whether you stand up or sit down. And at a slightly higher level of demand, there's things like Google. And if you Google how to have difficult conversations, Google UK gives you well over 182 million hits. But that's a bit like telling you how to build a radio transmitter. What I'm interested in is much more about building a radio receiver. What research is there? Well, it turns out that a review of the research literature shows almost nothing. And again, if you go to Google, there's practically nothing there either. In fact, instead of the 182 million hits I got previously, my first hit this time was from the BBC website trying to teach me better English. And yet, there are lots of people and organizations and roles whose main or significant function is to hear, help and handle with bad news, and they're well trained. But I put it to you that the most common group of people to receive bad news are these people, and they are not so well trained. But it's not as if hearing bad news is rare. Pre-COVID, the UK was running at 600,000 plus deaths per year. And if each death results in one bereaved person who has to tell only 5 other people, even that is an awful lot of deaths and bad news to talk about, even before we start adding other bits of bad news. And why does all this bad news matter? It matters because when somebody gives you their bad news, they're vulnerable, they're sharing their soul, they're fragile. And I really wanted to challenge you and ask, are you going to respect that gift of their soul, or are you going to pretend to respect it? Rather like somebody with a butterfly in a collection, you know? Stick a pin through it, mount it, display it, but pretend you're respecting it because you're only using gold pins. As NASA astronaut Chris Hadfield is reported as saying, there is no problem so bad that you can't make it worse. So let me give you a couple of personal examples of the things that people do wrong. Many years ago, my dad was an actor. And after a long fight with throat cancer, he lost his voice. And about 6 months after the operation, I was walking with him down the street. And I can remember someone coming up to us and going, Sid, I'm speaking loudly because I know you can't talk. Or when my elder daughter got cervical cancer, we got some interesting responses when we gave people the bad news. Things like, did she ignore the warning signs then? Or my personal favourite, that reminds me, my smear test is overdue as well. I've done this one myself. When my beautiful friend Ruth died, I remember exactly where I was when I got the bad news. I was on a train down to London on the Monday morning. And I'm afraid my response was to go, but she can't be dead. She was with me on Friday, as though eating cake in a cafe on a Friday afternoon is going to protect anybody from a brain hemorrhage over a weekend. And then there's trying to be supportive. We've all heard this one, I'm sure we have. You're strong, you'll get through this. Or, you've got to fight it. But all that does is put more pain on their pile. Because now they have to deal whatever the bad news is, and they have to deal with your expectations of them. So what should we do? I mean, it's all well and good me pointing out there's a problem, but if I've got nothing more to offer than there's a problem, I have no right to be on the red dot. Well, if we're somebody's friend, we should help, right? That's what friends do. But I want to point out that just because helping your friend is your responsibility, it doesn't mean that their problem is your problem. You can't catch their grief like you can catch COVID. That means you don't have to defend yourself like you're last man standing in the zombie apocalypse. You can afford to stay vulnerable. And if we're starting to talk about vulnerability, where better to start than with the work of Professor Brené Brown? So with all of that in mind, I would very humbly like to offer a framework which might help. It's not a script, it's a framework. Lord knows I want there to be a script, I want it to be that simple, but I don't think there is one. It's not like those French language books you took when you were at school, you know? The books that pretended that you could have a fixed conversation where the waiter says this and you say this, and the waiter says this and you say this, and and you end up with something that's choreographed like a competitive waltz. Real people are much messier than that. It's just a framework, not a script. But I want to remind you that just because your friend is your responsibility, their problem isn't your problem, which means that helping them is not something heroic, it's just something you should do. In fact, it's just a series of very simple and straightforward tasks. Let me unpack tasks and see what you think. T stands for take your time. Respond, don't react. Take a beat. Remember these two moments in the Kubler-Ross curve? If you're into the shock or denial sections of the model, things that might happen involve your adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol all kicking off, and your fight or flight syndrome kicks in to protect you from the shock. And it can feel like a shock. It can feel like a threat. Because the relationship you have with somebody, which means that they trust you enough to give you their pain, also means that you're going to care. So take a moment of silence. And don't worry, by the way, about how long that silence should be. Firstly, it is never as long as it feels from the inside. And secondly, silence is very often taken as a sign of respect. Stop sweating the silence. Take a moment. But in that silence, I want you to ask yourself some questions. We're all our own most important people. The phrase preservation instinct exists for a reason. But if you've taken that beat that I've just mentioned, that moment of silence, you've got time to step out from your emotional self-defense space and ask yourself some questions about the person in front of you. Things like, what do they want? What do they need? What do they not want? What would make it better? What would make it worse? What do I know? What do I not know? What am I assuming? Do they want a tea? Do they want a coffee? Do they want a hot chocolate? Do they want help or do they want a hug? Or do they want both or neither? And you keep asking yourself those questions until you have figured out something to do. And then you do that something. Now, that something, I can't tell you what it is. But I do want it to be respectful of what's been given to you. It's not like you have just been given a cheap plastic fairy from your gran for Christmas. You can't just go, oh, thanks, gran, and put it in some cupboard and never, ever, ever speak of it again. It wants to be something that respects what's going on in front of you. And importantly, it doesn't always have to be what other people think it should be. I remember meeting my friend Brian. Brian had terminal pancreatic cancer. His belly was distended with the cancer, his skin was yellowed with the jaundice, his head looked unnaturally big because he'd lost so much weight, and as I saw him, my first response was to go, "Good God, it's Gollum!" And Brian laughed, and I laughed. And we held each other and we cried and then we laughed some more. And in fact, we laughed so much the ward sister threw us out of the ward because we were disturbing the other people in the ward. So your something is weird. But once you've got your something going, I want you to keep at it. It's not a one and done. It's not something that happens immediately. It's not like it's a bit like going to the gym or losing weight. It's not something that happens immediately. You can't go to the gym once and come back with a six-pack. Trust me, I have tried. You just can't do it. I reiterate Brené Brown at this point. Rarely does a response make something better. What makes it better is a relationship of some kind. And by definition, that connection exists over time. Newcastle's connected to London by a railway line, right? But if there are no trains running, what kind of connection is that really? So I want you to keep at it until the something reaches its natural end. And then finally, take some time for yourself at the end, because during all of this, you're bound to have got wound up. And if you don't do something about all that energy that you've got floating around in your head, as sure as grass is green, it will spill out onto somebody else later. So take a few moments to protect yourself. I started today by suggesting that being given somebody's bad news and pain was a gift. And that's true. But like all gifts, there's a sting in the tail, because that gift comes with a moral responsibility. You have to honor that gift in some way. If somebody gives you a great birthday present, you honor it by giving them a Christmas present. If somebody gives you a picture, you honor it by hanging it on the wall. If someone gives you their pain, you honor it by... It's not as bad as it sounds, actually. Because on this occasion, maybe just the way you hear their pain can be its own honoring. Because one of the things, most of the things, almost all of the things that we learn about ourselves as human beings come from the response that the other people give us, the cues that they give us. And what that means is really, really simple. How you hear my bad news is the beginning of how I begin to heal.